The Ontario government is rolling back labour reforms introduced by the previous Liberal government. The changes include freezing the minimum wage at $14 an hour and changes to equal pay for equal work for full-time and part-time employees. We're joined this morning by Alex Lucifero, Managing Associate of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Good morning.
Morning, Annette.
Okay, you're going to break this all down for us. It sounds a little confusing, but it's at the end of the day not really that confusing. Let's talk about what the government introduced as of January 1st this year.
Sure.
Equal pay for equal work based on part-time and full-time employees, and how that is going to be changing now based on what the new government has decided to do.
That's right. So, and as employment lawyers, Annette, we advise employees and employers on their obligations and rights in the workplace. And last week, the government introduced, the Ford government introduced Bill 47, repealing some of the worker protections that employees had back from Bill 148 that was introduced in January of this year.
From the previous Liberal government.
From the previous Liberal government, exactly. And as a result of that, we had a couple of employers call us and say, well, since the government is repealing some of these protections, we'd like to save some money. Can we just piggyback on those reforms? And the big one we heard is with respect to equal pay and equal work, which is, well, we had to give some of these part-time employees raises as a result of this equal pay provision. Yeah. Can we now scale that back? And what we had to tell employers in that situation is, no, not necessarily. You cannot simply just reduce an employee's pay unilaterally, even if it's because of legislative changes. That's a very sticky situation. We had to advise employees to be very careful in a situation like that, and we wanted to get that message out simply because employers could land in a bunch of trouble because of that.
So give me a good example of what that would be.
Sure.
2 employees making X amount of dollars. Tell me what that would look like.
Sure. So again, the equal pay for equal work provision effectively protected part-time, casual, and temporary employees.
Okay.
Employees that were doing the work of a full-time employee and doing the same kind of work but being paid less because they were part-time or because they were temporary. And these are legitimate problems. I mean, we see this day in and day out in the industry. So what the Bill 148 and the Liberal government did was say, no, you have to pay those employees the same amount of money, the same hourly rate, or the same wage.
Even if they're working less hours, but if they're doing the same job, they still need to make that same amount of money.
That's exactly right, and that makes sense, right? Yeah. Well, what the current government is doing is actually repealing that provision. So there will be no more, whenever this bill is enacted, it's still not enacted yet, but at some point it will be this year. And when that happens, there will be no more equal pay for equal work provision.
Okay.
Now, what the difficulty there for employers is that does not necessarily mean that you can simply reduce that employee's pay. So let's say you had to bump that employee's pay up from, let's just say $15 an hour to $18 an hour to meet the requirements of this provision. You can't now all of a sudden say, well, the next day after this bill is enacted, reduce it back down to $15 an hour. That would be effectively a breach of the employment contract or a breach of the employee's terms of employment. It's what we call in employment law constructive dismissal. A constructive dismissal effectively means that because the employer unilaterally tried to change the terms of employment in a significant way, the employee would be allowed to decline that change, leave their employment, so effectively resign, and obtain a severance package.
If they don't want to resign, they want to keep their job, and they just want to stay where they were put, as you say is what the law says they have to do, the employer has to do. What do they do then if their boss says, well, look, no, the government's changing the laws, they're repealing it, so instead of 18, you're going back down to 15. What do they do? It's
a difficult situation for an employee to manage. What I would advise an employee in that situation is be strong. Say no. Say no, thank you. Do it politely, do it professionally, but you have every right as an employee in a situation like that to say no. The difficulty becomes if your employer then tries to force it on you, what do you do as an employee? And that's where the constructive dismissal comes into play, where you can effectively threaten to resign your employment and obtain a severance package. If you're a longer-term employee or an older employee, your severance entitlements are going to be significant, and that may lead to, well, either a severance package and moving on, or the employer reversing its decision and maintaining you at that pay.
Okay, interesting stuff. Alex, as always, thank you. Appreciate you
My pleasure,
breaking
Annette.
it down
Thanks for having
for
me
us.
again.